Dhurjjati Sarma. He is an assistant professor in the Department of Modern Indian Languages and Literary Studies at Guwahati University, Assam. He was earlier a production editor at Sage Publications, New Delhi, and before that, a research fellow in Northeast Asia Studies at Indira Gandhi National Center for the Arts, New Delhi. He is presently engaged in teaching and research in literary history, comparative literature, and cultural studies. His writings have been published under Palgrave Macmillan and in journals like Space and Culture, India, and Margins. He is presently working on a critical history of Assamese literature. So we welcome you, Dr. Sharma.
Thank you.
This virtual platform is all yours.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone, the faculty members of the Department of English, Karim City College, Jamshedpur, and all the organizers of this event, and all the participants of this course for inviting me to share my views on this very important topic that has been assigned to me, Renaissance and the Occidental Gaze. So I guess without much ado, I should straight away go into my discussion. So I'll be sharing my screen. Just a moment. Just give me a moment. Just let me know if I am visible, if my screen is visible. Can you see my screen?
Yes.
Yes. Okay. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. So I can't see anyone now. So please let me know if like something goes awry. Please let me know. So okay. Thank you, everyone. So this is my topic for discussion today: Renaissance and the Occidental Gaze. And here I begin with my presentation. So with the introduction, the Renaissance as a conceptual epistemological event in 16th century England was, we can argue, primarily centered on the primacy and agency of the human will and his desire to fashion an image of oneself as well as the one considered to be its other. So this image of one and the other is going to be central when we talk about the idea of the gaze. So what I'm going to do is that first I will talk about what essentially consisted in the idea of a gaze, and then I'll move into the idea of Occidental Gaze. And what I'm doing, I shall be taking recourse to some of the literary texts composed during that period, mostly from Shakespeare, and also a few paintings from the period to show how this whole idea of gaze operated within the Renaissance and also a few centuries subsequent to it. So this process of identity formation in consequence was a complicated one, and that involved juxtaposition of apparently contradictory states of being and contributed to the wide range of meanings that constituted the twin notions of the self and its other. Both these notions are indispensably connected with the concept of gaze, thereby impinging upon the dual coordinates of gazing and being gazed. However, before moving on to the concept of gaze as constituting the prime preoccupation of our discussion here, it would be worthwhile to understand how was the concept of self formulated and understood during the time of the Renaissance, and more specifically within 16th century England. In his book, Renaissance Self-Fashioning from Moore to Shakespeare, published in 1980, Stephen Greenblatt provided a striking exposition of the manner in which self was conceptualized during the early modern period. That's the period of our discussion. He says, and I quote, "There is in the early modern period a change in the intellectual, social, psychological, and aesthetic structures that govern the generation of identities. This change is difficult to characterize in our usual ways because it's not only complex, but resolutely dialectical. If we say that there is a new stress upon the executive power of the will, we must say there is the most sustained and relentless assault upon the will. If we say that there's a new social mobility, we must say that there is a new assertion of power by both family and state to determine all movement within the society. If we say that there's a heightened awareness of the existence of the alternative modes of social, theological, and psychological organization, we must say that there is a dedication to the imposition of control upon these modes and ultimately to the destruction of alternatives. Unquote. One recurrent model in the medieval world for self-fashioning was Christ. However, in the post-Reformation period, Kalyani spoke very well on Reformation yesterday, the disintegration of religious unity in England created new opportunities for individuals from every stratum of English society to pick and choose in the new ways to the degree to which religion would influence their identities. And this shift in focus from the imitation of Christ towards the manners of men enabled self-fashioning to acquire a new range of meanings. It describes the practice of parents and teachers. It linked to manners or demeanor, particularly that of the elite. It may suggest hypocrisy or deception and adherence to mere outward ceremony. It suggests a representation of one's nature or intention in speech or actions. Now I come to my analysis and discussion. Now, on the basis of this very brief appraisal on the dynamics of self at the intersection of the medieval and early modern period, we can redirect our focus on the aspect of gaze as constituting a crucial marker of the manner in which the proponents of early modernity in 16th century England imagined their presence as distinct entities above and beyond the grasp of lesser beings in the world order, not only vertically, but also horizontally. And this horizontal distinctiveness consisted in them being supposedly more endowed with accomplishments of the mind and intellect compared to their counterparts in other parts of the world. We find resonances of this sensibility in the famous speech by Hamlet on the unique position of man in the scheme of things. As Hamlet says, "What piece of work is a man? How noble in reason, how infinite in faculties, in form, and moving, how express and admirable in action, how like an angel in apprehension, how like a god, the beauty of the world, the paragon of animals. And yet to me, what is this quintessence of dust? Man delights not me." Here in Hamlet's remark, we witnessed the complex and the resolutely dialectical dynamics at work with respect to the conception of manhood. In the introductory to his celebrated work, The Elizabethan World Picture, E.M.W. Tilliard considers these lines as being taken as one of the great English versions of Renaissance humanism, an assertion of the dignity of man against the asceticisms of medieval misanthropy, while actually being at the same time Shakespeare's version of the orthodox encomium of what man, created in God's image, was like in his prelapsarian state and of what ideally he is still capable of being. However, taken in the context of this play, this quote of the Hamlet that I just read out, these lines are actually uttered by Hamlet to signify the very absence of those features in his conception of mankind. In other words, these very words provide an antithesis to themselves. The idea of the gaze, as revealed in literature, also functions in a similar manner. A closer look at the Hamlet's speech above will illustrate how he has encapsulated the the physical and mental world of the living beings, as well as their tangible and intangible faculties in a sweeping gaze, which in a way is both inward and outward. As we have noted in our reading of the play, Hamlet occupies a strategic position vis-a-vis other characters in the way he had the ability to study their behavior and mannerisms. His soliloquies, placed at significant places within the text, reveal not only the ongoing states of his mind, but also the findings of his studied gaze upon the chain of events unfolding right before his eyes. And when Hamlet tells Horatio that there are more things in heaven and earth, Horatio, than are dreamt of in your philosophy, he is rightly referring to those faculties of the mind that exist beyond consciousness and experience. For Hamlet, therefore, the capacity of his mind's eye to gaze and fathom the depth of the human mind is an essential component of his mission to avenge the murder of his father king. Now, in the Act 2, Scene 2, Hamlet reveals his plan to test the veracity of the ghost story and also to catch Claudius's gaze unawares for a moment with the guilt of his crime clearly revealing through his eyes. He says, and I have also included a painting by Alfred Domet, the late 19th century, where he is painting that play within a play scene. You may refer to that painting where Hamlet is actually thinking that I have heard that guilty creatures sitting at a play have, by the very cunning of the scene, been struck so to the soul that presently they have proclaimed their malefactions. For murder, though it have no tongue, will speak with most miraculous organ. I'll have these players play something like the murder of my father before mine uncle. I'll observe his looks. I'll tempt him to the quick. If I do blanch, I know my course. The spirit that I have seen may be a devil, and the devil hath power to assume a pleasing shape, and perhaps, out of my weakness and my melancholy, as he is very potent with such spirits, abuses me to damn me. I'll have grounds more relative to thing than this. The place the thing where I'll catch the conscience of the thing. So here I'm talking about how gaze works both inwards and outwards, how gaze could be both simultaneous as well as involuntary, how gaze could be both conscientious as well as sinful. So these dynamics, these kind of oppositions, dichotomies are revealed here when Hamlet talks about the possibility of catching Claudius red-handed for his crime. Now, Hamlet's plan here is not only crucial in the context of the events within the play, but also significant as far as his critical ability to gaze into the minds of beings is concerned. In other words, it is not only Claudius whose gaze shall reveal his culpability, it is also the taste of Hamlet's gaze in capturing the gaze of his target right at the moment of reaction. It's a kind of a blink and you miss kind of a situation. Further, it is also a moment that will certify whether Hamlet's encounter with the ghost of his father king was not a moment of mental/visual aberration on his part, or the consequence of him actually falling prey to the vagaries of the antic disposition that he has deliberately put on himself to avert the gaze of others from discovering his real intentions. We can argue that his tragedy, in part, also consisted in his inability to sustain his gaze at others without being gazed upon for long. In fact, the process of his gaze being exposed to the gaze of others began right after this play within the play scene and possibly reached its climax in the scene of Ophelia's funeral and his subsequent scuffle with Laertes. Just compared with the earlier scene between Hamlet and Ophelia, with Claudius and Polonius hiding and mocking their encounter between, Ophelia and Hamlet. So we see how the whole conception of gaze. I'm trying to use the example of Hamlet because if we have read the whole play, and the whole play is replete with instances where one character is constantly gazing upon someone else. We can even refer to when Hamlet and Gertrude are conversing and Polonius is eavesdropping. Right. So anyway, so the role of the gaze in Shakespeare's Hamlet and the manner in which it is integrated with the actions of the characters alert us towards the general tendency of the period to fashion a conception of the self that is both unique to oneself as well as pervasive across the social spectrum. After all, it is not possible for a person to formulate an opinion regarding the other person unless his or her own self is brought into question. Now, this begs the questions: is my own idea of myself dependent upon its uniqueness / difference from others with whom I inhabit a social cultural space? In extending my gaze upon the world, do I not end up gazing at my own specificities? What is the role of perspective in this regard? Can a change in my opinion of someone else threaten to overhaul or subvert the very idea of myself? These are questions that possibly define Hamlet's relationship with his fellow individuals, particularly vis-a-vis his mother Gertrude and his uncle Claudius. The very imagination of them engaged in an immoral or an unjust union threatens to unsettle his mental, spiritual equilibrium. And now this aspect of perspective that I just mentioned and the danger inherent in a frequent shifting of gaze is brilliantly brought forth by an event that Greenblatt discusses in his book, Renaissance Self-Fashioning from Moore to Shakespeare. Now, this is about a painting called The Ambassadors, done by Hans Holbein in 1533 and presently housed in the National Gallery, London, which featured Jean de Dinterville and Georges de Selve standing on either side of a shelf. Now, on the table are placed a number of things, a number of objects, which Greenblatt lists as follow, like the celestial and terrestrial globes, sundials, quadrants, and other instruments of astronomy and geometry, a lute, a case of flutes, a German book of arithmetic kept open by a square, an open German hymn book on whose pages may be seen part of Luther's translation of the Veni Creator Spiritus and his shortened version of 10 Commandments. Greenblatt further notes the objects on the table between them, between Dinterville and Shelve, set off splendidly by the rich Turkish cloth and exquisite mosaic pavement, represent a mastery of the quadrivium, that portion of the 7 liberal arts comprising music, arithmetic, geometry, and astronomy, while a mastery of the trivium, grammar, logic, and rhetoric, is implied by the very profession of the two figures. They are thus in possession of the instruments, both literal and symbolic, by which men bring the world into focus, represent it in a very proper perspective. Again, and I'm trying to equate the idea of gaze and perspective here. If we return to Hamlet for a moment, we have two principal characters from the play, Hamlet and Horatio, who could be said to have mastered these arts in a university where they had studied, which enabled them to encompass the world through their vision and intellect. I recall the incident when incident of the ghost, when Marcellus requests Horatio thus, that thou art a scholar, speak to it, Horatio. So coming back to the painting. Now the objects on the shelf represented all those tools and instruments which could aid man of that period to delve into and explore every aspect of the heavenly and the material world, and to cast his overwhelming gaze over and across the heaven and earth, and apparently leave no secrets unrevealed to mankind. Likewise, as viewers, we focus our attention upon every intricate object in the painting, much as Greenblatt has done in the paragraph quoted above. However, with a closer look and possibly with a slight change of perspective, we come to notice an anamorphic skull or a death head slashing across the middle bottom portion of the painting. Just if we look down, and if we look at the middle bottom portion, we see a skull, a kind of a disfigured skull which is being drawn. As Greenblatt reveals, viewed frontally, the skull is an unreadable blur in the center foreground of the painting. Only from a proper position at the side of the painting is it suddenly revealed. A view from the front, or in other words, a straightforward gaze would not reveal the contours of the skull. One has to redirect his or her gaze from a sideways angular position to experience the reality of the death head as a core component of the painting, which otherwise celebrates the mastery of man, possibly even over his creator. However, for this to happen, one has to abandon what is referred to as the normal vision. Hamlet has to wear his antique disposition in order to investigate the rotten state of Denmark. We must throw the entire painting out of perspective in order to bring into perspective what our usual mode of perception cannot comprehend. Whereas the presence of a death skull is common in paintings of the time, and is obviously a common metaphor signifying death or even danger, the scary aspect of Holbein's painting, and the one that befuddles the gaze of the viewer, is the presence of death in its uncanny inaccessibility and absence. Apparently, as Greenblatt observes, only when one turns his or her gaze away from the center of the painting that the death head comes into view. Further, if one notices, all the objects described in the painting are products of human endeavor. They help man in extending his scope of vision and thereby exert his authority over the world. The only component that escapes his grasp, and possibly also that of the viewer, is the presence of the skull, which is incidentally the only natural thing in the painting beyond the creative powers of human agency, barring obviously the two human figures. In fact, we can even argue that the death head is the only component in the painting which has registered human fashion. Now, this redirection of the viewer's focus upon the death head also constitutes a movement from the center of the painting towards the periphery. I mean, if we keep focusing on the center of the painting, we will only be noticing those objects which are kept right at the center, the one with which, Renaissance man or the Renaissance scholar identified himself. Only when we go to the periphery, here in the case when we move our gaze down to the bottom of the painting, we see something that threatens to subvert that very mastery of which the Renaissance man prides himself. Now, the center-periphery binary and its attendant change of vision could be extended to the Occident-Orient conception of the world. Here, now I would like to move to the other part. I'll be talking about how the whole conception of Occidental gaze operates. As far as the Latin origins of the words are concerned, the word Oriental derives from the Latin oriens, meaning the east, or the part of the sky where sun rises. Occidental, in contrast, derives from the Latin occidens, meaning the west or part of the sky where the sun sets. Now, the geographical regions known as the Orient and the Occident are named for their positions relative to one another, east and west respectively. The word Occident then refers simply to the western areas of the world, especially Europe and America. So here I'd like to clarify one thing, that be it Orient or Occident, we get three forms of the words. Like there is, here I'm talking about Occident. So there is Occident, there is Occidental, and there's Occidentalism. Now these three words have three different meanings. So when I'm talking about Occident, it refers to, as I said, that refers simply to the western area. It's a geographical signifier, right? It refers to a particular part of the world, which is the Europe and America, right? When I say Occidental, it refers to the agency that comes from that part of the world, Occidental, right? The gaze that emanates from those parts of the world. And when we say Occidentalism, then we are extending the scope of that word. Occidentalism, same with Orientalism, they signify a body of work. So when we talk about Occidentalism, it will also bring in how the East looks at the West, because then it becomes a body of work. Because when you say Orientalism, it's a body of work that could originate in the West as well as the East, right? So while trying to understand the concept of Occident and Orient, we need to differentiate between these three terms, like Occident, Occidental, Occidentalism, Orient, Oriental, Orientalism. The three refer to three different epistemological conceptions. So when we talk about the Occidental gaze, we are then essentially referring to the kind of vision or an outlook that originates from Europe and America. For the Occident, then, the experience of the Orient constituted likewise in a movement from its centralized location in the West, more specifically upon the Atlantic, towards either side of the oceans to the far corners of the world. However, as we witnessed in the case of our discussion on gaze, vis-a-vis Hamlet and then the Holbein's ambassadors, the gazer often ends up being gazed upon. And the act of gazing also involves a redefinition, if not outright abandonment of the gazer's own identity, only if anything of that sort exists in the singular sense of the term. Now, closely following Hamlet, was composed around 1601, Shakespeare composed another well-known tragedy called Othello, 1603-04, which not only carried forth his engagement with the dialectics of gaze, but also explored the Occident-Orient binary as a component in the fashioning of the Renaissance self. If we attempt to compare the protagonists of the four big tragedies of Shakespeare, we notice that between Hamlet, Othello, Lear, and Macbeth, it is the choice of a heroine, Othello, that has often given rise to the question: what prompted Shakespeare to undertake the tragedy of the Maid of Venice? There is historical evidence of the ambassador of the King of Barbary, which is roughly North Africa, being present in the court of London in the year 1600. And Shakespeare was performing when Elizabeth was still ruling, and Shakespeare was performing as a core member of the Lord Chamberlain's men. It could be possible that the Moorish embassy provided the model for Shakespeare's fashioning of Othello, for Iago does refer to him as a Barbary horse and an erring barbarian in the course of the play. On our left, we can see this image of the Moroccan ambassador to England, Muhammad al-Anuri, who supposedly had visited the Elizabethan court in the year 1600. In the introduction to the Arden edition of Othello, the editor E.A.J. Honigman attempts to establish the protagonist's position firmly within the social cultural geography of the play. He states, be he a black or a North African Moor, Othello's otherness remains. He is more a stranger. He comes from a mysteriously other world, a world that lies beyond our reach, hinted at rather than defined. Despite his self-introduction with Venice and Christianity, the Moor cannot shake off this mystery, a byproduct of his dark skin and of the associations this had in European minds. Now, reading this, there seems to be a feeling that the editor here raises more questions than he answers, including some regarding his own opinion on this matter. Nevertheless, I'd like to argue that Othello's position within the social cultural milieu of Venice is more that of an intermediary than anything else. He occupies a rather liminal position both in terms of space and time vis-a-vis the culture he was born into and the one that made him what he is. The case of Othello could be forwarded as a case or a situation wherein the traditional Occident-Orient binary gets problematized. Because let us accept the fact that what constitutes the personality of Othello is not merely his otherized exterior, but also his cultivated interior. And this is where we can invoke the outward dynamics of the gaze that similarly fashioned not only the responses of the other towards Othello, but also his own towards others, most prominently his wife, Desdemona. It is noteworthy that as readers and audience of the play, we first get to hear at length about Othello from the mouth of Iago, who frets and fumes over his non-appointment as Othello's lieutenant. Interestingly, we are introduced to Othello via Iago's misrepresentation of his character that ranges from his obsession with his pride and purposes to him being compared with an old black ram. It is Iago who informs Brabantio that his daughter and the Moor are now making the beast with two backs. Othello is further described by Roderigo as a lascivious Moor and an extravagant and wheeling stranger off here and everywhere. Now, these epithets work both ways. On the one hand, it might incite the common perception of the reader/audience in a predominantly white society towards persons of color. On the other hand, particularly in the context of the play, the reader or the audience may be positively inspired to witness the exact opposite as and when the character of Othello appears in person in the scene 1.2. Or the reader or the audience might have already gazed upon, now by this description of Iago and Roderigo, the reader and the audience might have already gazed upon an imaginary projection of Othello. And when he actually appears on the page or the stage, the audience might have been struck by a strange admixture of awe and repulsion. This is but one among many contraries or oppositions that the playwright leaves unreconciled. At this point, it would be worthwhile to echo the general anti-immigrant sentiment in the following proclamation by Queen Elizabeth I in the year 1601 on the increasing influx of niggers and blackamoors into England. An excerpt from a proclamation read like this. This was a proclamation issued by the Queen, 1601, Negroes and Blackamoors. Whereas the Queen's Majesty is discontented at the great number of niggers and blackamoors which have crept into the realm since the trouble between Her Highness and the King of Spain, and are fostered here to the annoyance of our own people. In order to discharge them of this country, Her Majesty hath appointed Caspar van Juden, merchant of Lubeck, for their transportation. This is to require you to assist him to collect such Negroes and blackamoors for this purpose. This was quoted in the introduction to the Arden edition of Othello. Now, however, Othello presents himself as a steadfast and dutiful warrior commander of the state, and seems to be perfectly at ease with his own situation when he says, "I fetch my life and being from men of royal seas, and my demerits may speak unbonated." He further says, "My parts, my title, and my perfect soul," says, "shall manifest me rightly." Therefore, he comes across as a person who, despite being unlike other Shakespearean heroes of that time in terms of appearance, could yet command respect and admiration accorded earlier to Julius Caesar and later to Macbeth as Shakespearean heroes, at least initially, and even Antony. Therefore, what exactly happens with Othello, in addition to being consumed by jealousy and suspicion that make him susceptible to the vile and wily words of Iago, and eventually to murder his own wife? I'd like to argue that Othello, as we come across at the beginning of the play, had a vision of himself as one who was destined to lead a life on the battlefield and had accordingly reconciled himself to his destiny. The Venetian society too saw him essentially as a warrior, and his martial accomplishments earned him a position of repute in their society. His identity as a general occupied the center stage of his preoccupation, and this led to a gradual relegation of the other dimensions of his personality to the periphery. He redefined his identity from the Occidental perspective, and he internalized the gaze that was accorded to him within the Venetian society. That led to a gradual effacing of those traits of his personality that possibly pushed him to the other side of the binary. Reference to Iago's and Rodrigo's references to his external appearance. Now, incidentally, his enemies capitalized on those very aspects that Othello attempted to gloss over by his references to his achievements on the battlefield. His speech to the Duke and the senators, justifying the use of witchcraft to win over Desdemona, provides a classic instance to examine Othello's position on the Occident-Orient binary and his eventually fateful endeavor to translate his martial bravery into marital bliss. This is in Act 1, Scene 3, when he's defending himself against Brabantio's charge that with some mixtures powerful over the blood or with some dram conjured to this effect, Othello has worked on the mind of his daughter. Othello describes the manner in which Brabantio used to invite him over to his place and was curious to know the story of his boyhood and youthful days, and all about the disastrous accidents and escapes that he passed through, while also being sold to slavery and his subsequent liberation from it. He talks of enters vast and deserts idle, rough quarries, rocks and hills whose heads touch heaven, and of the cannibals that each other eat, the anthropophagi, and the men whose heads grow beneath their shoulders. Here on the left, I am showing a part of a sketch that could have inspired, and this was drawn in 1572, Sebastian Munster's Cosmographia, which could have actually inspired maybe Shakespeare to put these words into the mouth of Othello. Now, the sources behind these representations, which Shakespeare might have consulted while drawing a word picture of these unknown and untraversed lands, included John Leo Africanus's A Geographical History of Africa, 1600, which was translated into English in 1600 by John Poree, Philemon Holland's translation of Pliny's History of the World, 1601, and Sir Louis Lucanus, The Commonwealth and Government of Venice, 1599. Now, A Geographical History of Africa, published in 1600, was the authoritative work on the geography of Africa at that time and was significant in shaping the idea of Africa for early modern Europeans. The Pori's letter to the reader tells the fascinating story of Leo's life, a tale of complex interaction between Europe and Africa, Islam and Christianity. Leo was born in Granada, where the Moors had ruled until 1492. He was educated in Fez and traveled widely to Italy and North and West Africa. In the Mediterranean, he was taken captive by Christian pirates, and having shown his exceptional learning, he was given as a slave to Pope Leo X. The Pope later freed him and persuaded him to be baptized as a Christian, though he seems to have died a Muslim in Tunis. Pori's account of Leo's marvelous escape from so many thousands of imminent dangers might remind us of Othello's tale of hairbreadth escapes in the imminent deadly breach. Like Leo, Othello tells of things sold to slavery, and we later learn that Othello was also a former Muslim, now baptized as a Christian. Now, Othello describes Desdemona as she, with a greedy ear, devour up my discourse. It's interesting when Shakespeare makes his protagonist Othello narrate his experiences of fighting in regions which could well have been the African continent. This actually affirms the liminal position that Othello occupies on the Occident-Orient binary. On the one hand, Brabantio's charges against Othello were particularly motivated by his inability to consider the latter as his son-in-law. He had no qualms otherwise in acknowledging the martial prowess of Othello. On the other hand, Othello claims to have excited the fantasy of Desdemona mainly through his account of the peoples and places that he himself considered dangerous and also exotic by his own standards. He places himself at a distance from them, possibly even in oppositional to them. This is where a clear definition of the Occidental gaze becomes problematic. So on the left, we can again see a pictorial depiction of the scene that Othello, when he was narrating his tales of bravery to Brabantio and Desdemona. And below we see a picture of Othello. So here, I mean, the thing is that the whole perspective of the gaze is problematized here. So when Othello is narrating tales of his bravery in Africa, and he is distancing himself by his description of those the peoples and places, so where is he locating himself? Is he or is he not a part of those people? Aren't the suspicions, aren't the prejudices that the Venetian society has within them also encapsulate him within that paradigm? So this actually sort of makes it difficult for us to be sure on which part of the binary can he be located. Now, Anya Lumba very succinctly brings to light when the aspect of the imaging, the idea of perception, image, when you create an image of something, so crucial to our discussion here, when she says, Othello yokes together and reshapes available images of blackamoors and Moors, giving us a black Moor who has both a slave past and a noble lineage, a black skin and thick lips, as well as great military skill and rhetorical abilities, a capacity for tenderness, as well as a propensity to violence. Unquote. We can argue that Othello, the protagonist, even possesses to a certain extent the qualities and refinement of character we witnessed in the case of the ambassadors above. However, we cannot deny that he also has within him tendencies that nullified and subverted all that goodness and finesse of his character. He is himself aware of those vices within him, and he deliberately attempts to gloss over them. Now, when Othello remarks that she loved me for the dangers I had passed and I loved her that she did pity them, is possibly hinting towards the irreconcilable differences between their respective gazes vis-a-vis their social cultural position. For Desdemona, the attraction towards Othello rested in him being different from the rest. Her gaze singled him out as being unique and unparalleled. She possibly lived with that impression throughout her life. But for Othello, on the other hand, her vote of confidence and a sense of compassion for the hardships that he endured provided him the emotional security that he sought from her. So coming from the other side of the binary, he believed that his conjugal union with Desdemona shall enable his complete integration into the Venetian society. What Iago did was to exploit this sensibility, this raw nerve, this raw part on the part of Othello, which gradually ended in alienating Othello from his intended company and pushed him more and more until he succumbed to his dreaded insecurities. Now, from the two tragedies by Shakespeare, we may now move to a comedy by him, A Midsummer Night's Dream, 1595, which is heavily invested with images that represented the Occidental version of East and India. Now, referred to as Shakespeare's most far-flung play in its geographical range, the play, dramatically localized in Athens and culturally rooted in England, very skillfully represented Europe's growing fascination with the East, particularly with India and its spice trade. More interestingly for us, there's the figure of a lovely boy stolen from an Indian king who becomes the prime subject of conflict between Oberon and Titania, and is instrumental in driving forth the action of the play, albeit in a passive manner. Now, fondly recollecting her association with the boy's mother, Titania, and Shakespeare presents a vivid picture of mercenary activities along the Indian coast, the most likely the Malabar coast. Titania says, the boy's mother was a votress of my order, and in the spiced Indian air by night, full often hath she gossiped by my side, and sat with me on Neptune's yellow sands, marking the embarked traders on the flood. When we had laughed to see the sails conceive and grow big-bellied with the wanton wind, which she, with pretty and with swimming gait following, her womb then rich with my young squire, would imitate and sail upon the land, to fetch me trifles, and return again as from a voyage rich with merchandise. But she, being mortal, of that boy did die, and for her sake do I rear up her boy, and for her sake I will not part with him. Now, below we see a painting by Henry Howard done in 1832, which basically represents the tension between Oberon and Titania for the Indian boy. Now, this passage above represents the Occidental visualization of an Indian night sky redolent with the aroma of spices as the backdrop against which the trading ships from the west used to come and go, carrying with them not only spices, but also images and narratives describing the opulence of the East. And as R.W. Desai notes, Titania's metronymic lines on the pregnancy of her Indian companion and the sails of the ships growing big-bellied with the wanton wind evoke images that bring together increase both in terms of fertility as well as commerce. So in this regard, however, we must, however, keep in mind that the East-West trading relationship during the 15th and 16th centuries, the East-West trading relationship between the 15th and 16th centuries seemed to be one of mutual concord and cordiality, as is evident from the relationship between Titania and her Indian companion. The conflict between Oberon and Titania within the play was symbolic, according to Desai, of the one that was raging on in Europe between England and Portugal, respectively. It spilled over to India, and in this way, the Orient also became a battleground for the European powers vying with one another for trading rights and monopolies. Shakespeare's time witnessed the gradual rise of England as one of the naval superpowers, most prominently with its victory over the Spanish Armada in 1588 and establishment of the English East India Company in 1600. Now, the naval success of England and the expansion of its outreach to the corners of the world was echoed in the play more than once. First by Puck, when he claims that I'll put a girdle round about the earth in 40 minutes. And then by Oberon, we the globe can compass soon, swifter than the wandering moon. Its expansion of this global vision was also at the same time an attempt to perpetuate the Occidental epistemological perspective, one that we see been painstakingly represented to the minutest details in Hals Holbein's The Ambassador. So below I provide two popular images. One on the left was very popular of a later date, though, of Robert Clive with the Mughal Emperor Shah Alam II, and how this is after the British Army under Robert Clive gains the right to collect taxes in Bengal. This is a very popular image. And here we see, if we look closely at this image, we see the representation of the characters. We see people from both the Occident and the Orient. So this whole binary, the whole dichotomy is evident here, and also in this other painting that was done in 1825-30. So here, if we see the official of the East India Company riding in an Indian procession, we see the officer in the middle. Okay, look at his size, look at his stature, look at his grandeur, and two of his subordinates follow him. They are Indians, but they look very downcast, and we see a lot of people surrounding them, the soldiers who have been possibly inducted into the British Army, and at the behind we see people who are witnessing a change in the ruling dispensation. So the very size and quality and the whole idea of perspective, if we see the British officer is there right in the middle, is occupying the central space. So the first time we look at the painting, our gaze falls straight on the image of the official. This is how the idea of perspective worked, and this also added to the primacy of the object that was accorded importance. But only when we sort of shift our gaze to the periphery that we see other details. Okay. Now, this new Occidental epistemology was aided by a series of early English travelers who made repeated journeys to the East. Amongst the ones who visited India during and around Shakespeare's time, this is roughly 1579 to 1630, the time of their visits, included travelers like Thomas Stephens, Ralph Fitz, to which we are coming very soon, John Mildenhall, William Hawkins, Thomas Rowe, Thomas Coryat, William Finch, Nicholas Whittington, Edward Terry, and Henry Lord. In this connection, Richard Hakluyt's The Principal Navigations, Voyages, Traffics, and Discoveries of the English Nation, the first edition came out in 1589, the second edition came out between 1598 to 1600, is the most important collection of English travel writing ever published and contributed immensely to the field of Occidental perspective of world beyond its frontiers. The territories it describes encompass nearly every domain of European engagement and exploration of the period, from the New World to Muscovy, the Levant, Persia, the East Indies, and Africa. Published in 3 massive folio volumes, approx 1.76 million words, the work was instrumental in promoting English expansion through colonial and trade ventures around the globe. On the left, I provide the cover page of Richard Hakluyt's book, and this is a multi-volume book, right? And this actually, sort of describes one after another, the visits of these early travelers to the East and India. Richard Hakluyt provided a detailed summary of Ralph Fisher's voyage to India, which is remarkable in providing a first-hand narrative of India's geography. He says, the voyage of M. Ralph Fitch, merchant of London, by way of Tripolis in Syria, to Ormuz, and so to Goa in the East India, to Cambaya, and all the kingdom of Jalaluddin Akbar. This is the great Mughal, is a reference to Jalaluddin Akbar, the great Mughal, to the mighty river Ganges, and down to Bengala, to Bakola and Chanderi, to Pegu, to Yamahe in the kingdom of Siam, and back to Pegu, and from thence to Malacca, Ceylon, Cochin, and all the coast of the East India. Began in the year of our Lord 1583 and ended 1591, wherein the strange rites, manners, and customs of those people, I repeat, wherein the strange rites, manners, and customs of those people, and the exceeding rich trade and commodities of those countries are faithfully set down and diligently described by the aforesaid M. Ralph Fitch. So here, it's not only a description of the travel routes of Ralph Fitch, but also about the way the people in these places conducted themselves. It's not only the story of the people, and also their economy, the rich economy, the opulence of the rich of the East, with its trade and commodities. These were iterated many times so as to attract the attention of the people out there in Britain, and also forming an opinion, a vision of the East. The Ralph Fitch became an important and dependable authority of that time on matters concerning India. And it may be noted that he was frequently consulted by the officials of East India Company in the course of his expedition to India. Fitch had also studied the rites, manners, and customs prevalent in the places he visited, and as Arnold Wright conjectured, ever on the lookout for local color, Shakespeare would have quickly discovered Fitch and drawn upon his vast store of out-of-the-way knowledge for those wonderful stories of human nature, which still hold a unique place in the world's literature. A detailed study of Ralph Fisher's maritime adventures, as described in Richard Hakluyt's The Principal Navigations, Voyages, Traffics, and Discoveries of the English Nation, and elsewhere, as well as narratives of the early English/European travelers to the East, shall prove enlightening, not only for the light they shed on those parts of the world beyond our frontiers, but more importantly, for enabling us to understand the manner in which the Oriental world was fashioned within the Occidental epistemology. The knowledge of the Orient provided a new social and cultural energy to the aspirations of the West, since more and more insights into the rites, manners, and customs of the East enabled them to theorize themselves as a differential class of people, soon to willingly take upon themselves the burden of the civilizing mission. In fact, the Renaissance witnessed only the beginning of the Occidental fascination with the East. The engagement became more and more deep as we move further into the 17th century. the book 2 of Milton's Paradise Lost, 1667, 1674, this is the third quarter of the 17th century, begins with the following lines, which clearly show the influence of the narratives made popular by the early English/European travelers into the East. It describes, high on the throne of royal state, which far outshone the wealth of Ormuz and of Ind, or where the gorgeous East with richest hand showers on her kings Berberic pearl and gold, Satan exalted set. Unquote. Here Satan has been projected as being more opulent and possibly more ruthless than the image of the Oriental despot that had caught the fancy of the Occident. And then, again in Book 9, there is a vivid description of the fig tree beneath whose branches Adam and Eve seek asylum after their dreaded sin and wrap themselves up with its leaves to conceal their nakedness. Milton says, it's quoted, so counseled he, and both together went into the thickest wood. There soon they chose the fig tree, not that kind of for fruit renowned, but such as at this day to Indians known. In Malabar or Deccan spreads her arms, branching so broad and long, there oft the Indian herdsman, shunning heat, shelters in cool and tends his pasturing herds. Unquote. India was seen as the land of the heathens and the pagans, and the sinful primal pair of Adam and Eve seem to have abandoned the Christian world of the paradise and sought refuge at one of its corners, deep and away from civilization. Now, as we move towards the conclusion of this discussion, I'd like to briefly talk about an important work that was composed in the first quarter of the 17th century and that exerted perceptible influence on a later work composed during the Romantic period. Samuel Taylor Coleridge's poem, Kubla Khan, written probably in the autumn of 1797, was deeply influenced by Samuel Purchas's book, Purchas's Pilgrimage, or Relations of the World and the Religions, published in 1626, the fourth edition, which described the stately palace which Kublai Khan had built in Jammu. I'm quoting from the text, the 1626 text, hence the oddity of the spellings. In Jammu, did Kublai Khan build a stately palace encompassing 16 miles of plain ground with a wall, wherein are fertile meadows, pleasant springs, delightful streams, and all sorts of beasts of chase and game, and in the midst thereof a sumptuous house of pleasure, which may be removed from place to place. One of the great emperors of ancient Tartary, Kubla Khan, was the grandson of Genghis Khan and provided the historical embodiment of what came to be known as the Oriental despot. The very association of despotism with the Oriental monarch has since been questioned, and as we have very well understood, is the product of this differential imagination of the Occident. Now, as I conclude, the Occidental gaze upon, or the Occidental imagination, or the reconstruction of the East or the Orient is a fruitful and productive subject of study, in that every reading of a text illuminates newer and more problematic areas of engagement. The subject has, since the Renaissance, accrued upon itself further layers of exposition and interpretation, particularly in its complicity with the histories of imperialism and colonialism. The present study had just endeavored to scratch the surface of this discourse in the initial days during the 16th and 17th centuries, particularly from certain select perspectives of literature and fine arts. A detailed analysis of primary texts produced during that period is obviously the first prerequisite for a study of this magnitude and significance. And here are the works that I have cited from. Okay, thank you. And over to you.
Thank you, sir. Neha ma'am, please.
Thank you. Yeah, thank you so much, Dr. Sharma. It was very, very enriching and enlightening, quite different from what we perceive. And it was actually a different gaze altogether to Hamlet and to Othello, and how India is present in Renaissance and later texts. So I'm sure students have some questions or maybe observations, certain doubts which they want to clarify.
One thing I just wanted to say that, just wanted to share my experience of working on this particular area, because, when we talk about Occidental gaze, it's not a movement like Reformation. It's not area of full-fledged study like humanism or geography or religion or politics. So the fact was that I had to take recourse to literary text to show how it took shape within that period. Number one. Number two, when we talk about gaze theory, so this is something that usually is attached with media, film studies, and even gender studies. But the fact was that I didn't try to actually bring them here, because the fact was I wanted to explore the way they were conceptualized within the Renaissance. Right. So for me, applying film theory or media theory, it will be kind of a retrospective placement of things about conceptions which may not have existed at that point of time. So I tried to take examples from the texts that were composed during that period. So, and then I tried from the Renaissance, I tried to move into the 19th century rather than starting into the 20th century and going back. So I tried to see how this epistemology developed within the Renaissance and how it has progressed so far. So so this is what I wanted to say. So I would love to have questions and your observations on the presentation. And by the way, was the audio clear? I mean, I hope the audio was clear.
Everything was clear, and you have succeeded in combining everything and the way you wanted to present it, that the gaze from Renaissance period. And it was very interesting to note how you have, talked about Hamlet, the inward gaze and the external gaze, and its presence in all over the play. So that was something very interesting. And of course, the Othello and the background of everything was quite interesting. His travel and references of African embassy, and the very much the painting to ambassadors, that was also very interesting. So let's see what students have to ask. Okay, they are thanking you for a wonderful lecture. And then Rashri is there. She has one question.
Okay.
Thank you so much, sir, for the beautiful interpretation of the Oriental and Occidental gaze in the context of Renaissance. But I wish to further understand how the Occidental and Oriental gaze paved way for the white superiority over brown, especially in terms of skin color, despite the fact that the Oriental beauty has often been fascinatingly captured in the text.
Okay.
So the contradiction, yeah.
Okay, thank you for this question, because this actually allows me to talk about one aspect in Othello that I thought I would talk about, but then I didn't. All right. Now here, when we talk about the Occidental and Oriental gaze and the question of white superiority over, it's like Occident versus Orient is not directly a conflict between white and black. Because see, even within the Venetian society, if we see now, within the Venetian society, what did Iago say to Othello? That see, Othello had this imagination that Desdemona is unique. She's not like any other Venetian women of that period who are immoral, who have easy virtues, right? She's different from the rest. What Iago tried to make Othello realize that no, Desdemona is no different from other Venetian women. She has the propensities to cheat you. Even Brabantio says, look to her. She has deceived her father. She may deceive you too. So what does that reiterate? The questions of morality had actually spilled over both the binaries. It's very difficult, actually. Number one. Number two, see, when we talk about superiority, especially in the Renaissance, see, we have to make sure the Renaissance was the period where the slave trade had not yet picked up speed. The slave trade and the whole idea of the African slave trade, this is something that happens at a slightly later period, right? Whereas the Renaissance was the period when the Europeans were actually amazed at the Eastern opulence. I mean, even if we take the Indian context, during Akbar's time, when the visitors came, I think Sir Thomas, I'm not very sure who visited, I think that in 1600, there was a visitor from Elizabeth who had visited Akbar, right? Even Ralph Fitch had a reference to Akbar. I mean, at that point, they did not get that permit. It's only in Jahangir's time when the Britishers get this permission for setting up trading posts, I guess, in Surat. Right. So and also this Moorish ambassador, when he visited Queen Elizabeth, he visited Elizabeth in his full regalia. Right. So even the blacks were not considered as inferior at that point of time. They had their own opulence. They had their own stature in the society. Right. So when we talk now, this gaze doesn't operate in terms of a superior. So when I'm trying to say that, this is how the Occident viewed the Orient, I'm not trying to show that the Occident had a superior view of itself. On a very high moral ground, they perceived the Occident. This doesn't apply during the Renaissance. It's only happened during the later period, when usually they take a foothold and when the whole Oriental discourse develops. It's only then this particular thing happens. But during this period of Renaissance, actually they occupy a level playing ground. And it shows in Midsummer Night's Dream. In Midsummer Night's Dream, in the play it shows, because the relation between Titania and the Indian boy's mother, that's not a relation like a master-slave. It's almost on an equal footing. She's her friend, and that's because of her responsibility towards her friend that she wants to protect the Indian boy. Right. So I think the dynamics were somewhat different during the Renaissance. Obviously, this requires much more study, and possibly I am also speculating. A deeper study would reveal many more layers of meaning within this particular area. Okay, then second, the Oriental beauties have been fascinatingly captured. I mean, this is all like the opulence that I'm talking about. I mean, this is, beauty, because beauty, as we understand, is something that has been perilously sort of juxtaposed with questions of morality. All right, so, you have beauty with morality, beauty without morality. Right? Because this is something that a discourse that has been highly problematic ever since that period. So
maybe Rashi is trying to actually ask that why this equation changed. If in the time of Renaissance this was on equality, or so why this supremacy changed?
Yes. That's because later on the interaction became more frequent. Because of the Renaissance period, we had a select number of European travelers who used to come and visit the East. But once trading rights were achieved, as and when routes of travels became more frequent, then more people from the East, from the West started visiting the East. Right. So when the frequency changed, the body of knowledge that consisted in the representation also expanded equally. Right. So this first-hand encounter, as and when, so then the whole idea of developing a discourse on the East took shape. We see initial hints in Ralph Ficht's, when Haeckel described Ralph Ficht's, he took down diligently the notes on the eastern people and places. The discourse started then, but it picked up speed later on. And later on, when trading rights and this kind of conflicts started, so it became necessary to prove that yes, we need to rule over you. We need a justification to enslave you. So the superiority inferiority discourse actually came later on when the idea of political superiority came into the picture. In Renaissance, it was not an idea of political superiority.
Yeah. Later on, maybe they have worked on this strategy that how to rule and how to get this. Yeah.
How they had to work on a strategy. Yes, this process started during the Renaissance, but it picked up speed. And this picked up speed at the later part of the 17th century. After possibly when America went out of England's hand, then they started looking more closely to Asia and Africa. Yeah.
Cool. We have another question from Kumar Yashwant. Thank you, sir, for such a wonderful lecture over the topic. And his question is: did translations of Indian classic works influence works of English writers during higher or later Renaissance period, as it was doing during age of Enlightenment when William Jones translated Shakuntala and sent a copy to it? Some work was being translated and it was a kind of influence on
exact references to that, because we don't find, say, if we talk about Shakespeare, we don't find him ever referring to any Indian work that was composed. Possibly by later 17th century, there could have been some work. I don't have exact information regarding that, whether...
And maybe oral stories from the travelers.
See, we have Dryden's play on Aurangzeb, which was composed, I guess, sometime later part of the 17th century. So there was Dryden's play on Aurangzeb, right? So I don't have any particular text in mind, but the discourse actually started from the later part of the 18th century, as you rightly pointed out. When William Jones translated Shakuntala, yeah, that was when, because that's when Goethe. See, I mean, you have to try to understand. This is when Goethe actually proclaimed that, when he read the translation of Shakuntala, this is the moment when we are moving from national literature to the conception of world literature. So this very proclamation by Goethe signifies the fact that no, there were not enough works of note composed before Jones had taken up this translation. Otherwise, Goethe, a very well-read man, wouldn't have made such a proclamation that this actually opened his eyes to the East. So this proves to be something. And okay, another thing, but I do feel, I mean, I have this feeling that during the late 18th century, when I read Kubla Khan, I have this feeling, and I wanted to share this feeling with you. I mean, I shared this feeling with my students when I was teaching them Kubla Khan. If you have read if a closer reading of the poem signifies that possibly, in Indian context, we have this idea of Sagar Manthan, right? That when frequent, how does Sagar Manthan work? The whole way of Manthan is compared to either brainstorming, right? Now, Kubla Khan was an imagination of Coleridge in a fit of his opium drunkenness, right? When he went into the deep reservoirs of his mind, and the whole idea of that the river that flushes out, we find references to that in Kubla Khan. I mean, I find some kind of a references, some kind of a similarity between the concept of Sagar Manthan and the concept of the way it's described in Kubla Khan. So there could be some kind of a transference of knowledge. I'm not denying that in the late 17th or 18th century, but during the Renaissance, I suspect that if they actually had access to something, some tangible translation per se. If something came via Arabic, I'm not very sure, because if something came via Arabic, it could be, but this is something that I also have to find out. Thanks for that question. This gives me a outlet to explore. Thank you. Thanks a lot.
So thank you so much, Dr. Sharma. You have given all the answers, or you have answered all the queries, and there are so many compliments there in the chat box for you. And now, in the end of the program, I would like to invite Vasudhara, our colleague, young colleague, to offer vote of thanks.
Thank you, Neha ma'am, and thank you, Professor Sarma, for that wonderful lecture, because it has taken us on a lovely journey across Shakespeare's landscape. We had close acquaintances with many small details that would ordinarily have been missed out in the appreciation, in the dramatic appreciation of Shakespeare that we often do in class. And it is very relevant that you choose the Renaissance as the point where Orientalism begins and the entire Orientalist discourse begins to be crafted. Because when we were talking about Renaissance and its discontents, this was what the discontent, specified. The fact that the opening up of new vistas of knowledge also meant the rewriting of history from that point onwards. So that was the point. It was a very fertile point of cultural contact where people, different races, different cultures, different religions were coming in close contact with one another. And that contact, because of the obvious power that Europeans had, that contact gave them the authority to construct the gaze, which later on, Saeed is going to talk about. So I believe that it was a wonderful, introduction, and the way you did it through pictures and by pointing out details from texts that students are likely to be familiar with made the entire presentation very interesting. We are very grateful to you for this wonderful session with us. And we hope that our students will go back to their texts and will go back to this entire rich and fertile period in history to reconsider their ideas and assumptions. Thank you very much. Thank you very much, students who have been wonderful listeners throughout these 15-day session. And thank you so much for this grand presentation. Thank you.
Okay.
Over to you, Yahya sir.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
Thank you, sir. Thank you so much.
Okay. So if you have any other comments and observations, you may please, Yahya sir has my email address. So if you have any queries or concerns,
All of